Hello, my name is Maria Titizian, and welcome to Examining the Context podcast. My guest, as always, is Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, author of EVN Security Report. Welcome to the program, Nerses.
Great to be here, Maria.
We're going to be talking about the October briefing called The Delicate Art of Negligence, Armenia's Security Thinking and Military Decline. After the end of the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, we were confronted with many shocking truths. We learned that we weren't prepared. We realized we had underestimated the adversary, and we had leaned into myths. We're great at myth building, yes? So there are many lessons to be drawn. The question is, have we learned those lessons and what are we doing? In your report, I discussed this with Rubina last week during our weekend review podcast. We talk about all of the articles that we published that week, and we both felt that there was a lot of anger in your writing for this particular briefing because you're looking at what happened and what we did and didn't do in terms of preparing ourselves. There are two key dates that you mentioned. The first is the 1997 bilateral security treaty with Russia. And then in 2002, Armenia joined the Collective Security Treaty Organization instead of developing its own security architecture and increasing its military power capabilities. You write that we basically outsourced our security to Russia. The question might sound like a very simple question, but it needs to be asked is why? Why did we choose to outsource our security to Russia?
It's a very good question, Maria. And just kind of touch up on your initial statement. It wasn't so much anger, but sheer frustration when developing the content for this report, which is part of a broader book project on the 2020 war that kind of led to, observations of negligence and at the borderline criminal neglect of responsibility. And this ties into your question, right? How did this come into being? And what Armenia did was, by virtue of signing the 97 bilateral treaty with Russia, which is a security agreement, and then joining the broader CSTO security architecture, Armenia basically fell into the trap of dependency, thinking that they need not invest exponentially in their security capabilities because there is this security arrangement that they're part of, which would solve or address their problems if need be. So, this false logic of having a security guarantor created what we call a moral hazard. Basically, it became strategically reasonable for Armenia's governments during that period to think along the lines of we need not invest in the military exponentially because that problem is going to be solved by a third party actor who will guarantee our security. So Armenia's military thinking, military development, military reforms were disincentivized from engaging in innovation or reforms. Because the logic was if something happens, we have a solution, and that solution is Russia and the CSTO. And so that thinking basically produced a culture of stasis where we did not have development and progress that was commensurate with the progress and development we're seeing Azerbaijan undergoing. And so Armenia's regimes, starting from the Kocharian regime and continuing with the Sarkisian regime, had basically made the decision that Armenia's security issues will be solved by Russia. This abdication of agency to some extent became the biggest problem because then that became a structural and systemic problem. Because if your argument or if your position for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years is that extended deterrence or outsourcing of your security to a third party is the doctrine that shapes your policies, well, after 5 years, 10 years of this modality of policy making, your system becomes designed within that paradigm. Altering or rupturing that becomes extremely difficult. And so the systemic byproducts, the path dependency of this approach created a very, very serious paradox for Armenia. We knew by 2016, matter of fact, we knew by 2015 that we need urgent reforms because Azerbaijan was already ahead of the game with us. But at the same time, the system and the structure of our military thinking, of our security architecture was such that it was not conducive to the innovation and the change that we needed. So Armenia ended up throwing itself into this trap of dependency. And the reason why I noted 97 and 2001 is because this is when it started. Whereas Azerbaijan, while it went through very difficult times in the First Qarabakh War and afterwards, did not fall into that trap. They proceeded to develop an independent security policy and an independent security capacity. Armenia did not do that. So by 2021, I'm sorry, by 2020, right, Azerbaijan had become the dominant military force in the region, while Armenia's capacity in a 10 to 12-year period had exponentially decreased. Why? Because Azerbaijan built its army, while Armenia said we don't have to build as much because Russia would solve our problem. So we engaged in systemic laziness and negligence, where Azerbaijan, for all its corruption and petro-autocratic characteristics, invested heavily in strengthening their military. And so the outcome was what we got.
I'm sorry, Nerses, but you didn't answer the question why. You explained what Armenia did, but why did Armenia choose to outsource its security? Because it felt it couldn't, because it felt protected, because it believed in the promises?
No, no. The government at that point found it to be in its strategic interest to basically outsource its security to Russia and thus utilize those funds for whatever endeavors they had, which ranged from corruption to various other investments in Armenia's economy. So, investing in the military is a very big responsibility for every government. It takes a big toll on our budget, especially a country that's supposed to be militarized. Armenia was spending approximately 400 million, 500 million on its military instead of spending close to 8, 900 million. And so the government, co-chair regime's thinking was instead of allocating all of those funds to the military, those funds could be used for whatever reasons they were using it for. It would make no sense for them to expand that much thing, finances and resources on the military if they could rely on Russia to address that gap. So the thinking was being in Russia's security architecture was preferable than undergoing through the process of developing independent security capabilities. That's why we never had a research and development in Armenia with respect to the security realm. We've never had military industry in Armenia, military industrial complex because of that. The whole logic was we'll just get it from Russia. And so we didn't produce anything. We didn't do engage in an innovation because to answer your question, the why, because the decision was made that instead of expanding resources and work and effort within that sector, we will outsource that sector to a third party. This was a decision that government made. Now, that decision became embedded in the overarching structure and system of Armenia's defense architecture, and that basically self perpetuated itself until 2020. So, the why is a fusion of both failed strategic thinking at the military level, at the defense level, and also, yes, the political objectives of the government in power. Now, of course, we could engage in the politics and say it was conducive to Kocharian's illiberal regime to be part of Russia's architecture because it also provided his regime security, right? If you're a Russian vassal, if you're a new Russian colony, then Russia will offer you the given resources that you need, and so your regime will have both domestic stability and externally you need not worry about anything because you're a satellite. Well, we saw that vassalage through time weakens a state, and that's precisely what happened with Armenia.
But could one argue that Armenia really didn't have many choices? Let's say it did spend 800 to 900 million dollars on annually on its military. Would that have solved any of its problems?
Of course, he would have had, because Armenia is not unique as a small state facing a wealthier and, with respect to size, a larger enemy, right? Taiwan doesn't spend as much as China. Okay, the Baltics can come nowhere close to spending as much as the threat they get from Russia. And in the article, I note this, right? It's nonsensical to say Armenia could spend cent for cent of what Azerbaijan is spending. But the question is, in 1997, Armenia remained in a position of strength, right? What was Armenia's policy in 97, in 98, in 99, in 2000, into 2001 with respect to maintaining and enhancing this power disparity we had with Azerbaijan, right? And as such, even if Azerbaijan spent more, spending in of itself would not suffice in disrupting Armenia's capacity for deterrence. The question isn't simply a numerical treatment of capability. The question is, Azerbaijan spent that much to be able to overcome Armenia's deterrence capabilities. All Armenia had to do was to spend sufficiently to mitigate Azerbaijan's threat and thus preserve deterrence. So, spending to have deterrence is very different than spending to be able to engage in an offensive war. So the argument here isn't that why didn't Armenia spend enough to be able to engage in offensive war with Azerbaijan? That is a nonsensical argument. The question is, when you see your opponent spending exceedingly more than you, when you see your opponent buying high precision weaponry, when you see your opponent procuring weapon systems that you know you lack the capability to sufficiently address or mitigate, what were you doing to address those developments? And so the question then comes to a very, very simple thing, common denominator. Nothing, right? Armenia did not do anything to address those developments because, again, its security thinking and the systemic factors that shape that thinking followed a single paradigmatic conclusion. Russia will address your problems. Therefore, you need not think about or worry about addressing those disparities. And so, this is not simply the decision of one individual, right? This is not simply a question of someone was being conspiratorial and evil and setting Armenia up to fail. No, this is a case of a culture of negligence that became reproduced and self produced itself through time.
I do want to talk about what you call nescience or ignorance and negligence. Just I want to come back to the 4 Day War in 2016. You said earlier, and you wrote also in the briefing, that by 2015, Armenia's political and military leadership knew that if there was a war, they could not forget about winning. They couldn't even sustain themselves for any period of time. 2016, 4 Day War. How do you explain what happened after 2016 that led us to 2020? That in those 4 years, of course, we had the 2018 revolution and then we had COVID and everything else. But I mean, the level of negligence is mind boggling to me.
And this is my point, right? That negligence is a systemic byproduct because uh, any attempt to reform was basically going to be nearly impossible by virtue of structural systemic obstacles, and this is why nothing was done, and that thus it produced a culture of negligence. But to your initial point, Armenia's Ministry of Defense in 20 from 2014 to 2015 did an extensive internal review of its capabilities. They did a force correlation study, to use a term in military science, in being able to gauge Azerbaijan's capabilities and Armenia's capabilities. And the internal findings of this report, right, was that Armenia simply lacks the ability to confront Azerbaijan in a full-scale war. And more so, the power disparity had reached at such a level that Armenia will not be able to contend Azerbaijan even within a defensive posture. And so we knew Armenia's military knew this in 2015. We also saw a lot of young Western trained officers in the military producing material that said reforms are necessary, reforms are needed, or else this asymmetry is going to be very, very dangerous. But this was ignored by the military brass because they were convinced that Russia would not let Azerbaijan attack. If we look at Armenia's policies, right, during this period, then what happened? There was an understanding and knowledge of the disparity. But the hope was that the problem would be addressed not through Armenia's military capabilities, but the outsourcing mechanism of Russian intervention. And so it was basically all eggs in one basket military doctrine. When the 2016 war happened, Armenia had extraordinary losses in 4 days. We can sugarcoat it, we could, conceal it, we could talk about the heroism of our soldiers. The last part is true, but the first 2 points are completely nonsensical, right? Azerbaijan demonstrated that its 8 years of military reforms and relative professionalization were going to be a severe problem for Armenia's defenses, and their utilization of aerial unmanned systems was quite devastating. And their ability to basically, in 4 days, take almost 800 hectares of territory, and we talked about the whole Leda Tepe positions and all that stuff Azerbaijan was able to do. This was a test run, and it proved to be relatively successful, right? Armenia's government Armenia's Ministry of Defense and the government after the 2016 war did an autopsy. Okay, they did an internal review. And their conclusion was that the military performed very well, that unmanned aerial systems drones are not seriously do not pose a serious problem for Armenia, and that Azerbaijan's success was primarily due to the element of surprise. And therefore, the only changes, only reforms they made after the 4-Day War was to add a bunch of cameras throughout the front lines to mitigate the element of surprise. Anything beyond that was basically not done because the determination of Army's military strategists, right, who are Russo Soviet trained, was as such. And President Sarkisian signed off on this. And so our military refused to understand, right, not only there was a power disparity, that the consequences of this power disparity were extraordinary. Now, when David Donoyan became defense minister in 2018, he brought the circle of Western trained, NATO trained officers, and Donoyan himself had quite a bit of exposure to NATO training, and he did produce content that said Armenia needs very quick and immediate reforms to mitigate the disparity. But again, the system and the structure of the military did not allow these reforms to proceed. So, aside from failed thinking, aside from systemic negligence, you had structural barriers that basically made it impossible for Armenia's military system to close the asymmetry gap with Azerbaijan. And again, this is a byproduct of 12, 15 years of developments, and it cannot be changed overnight. So, to answer your question, not only did we not learn our lessons from 2016, but whatever lessons that we learned from 2016, we were not able to basically utilize those into a new military doctrine. And so, when 2020 came around, right, the power asymmetry became very, very obvious. We realized that we really don't stand a chance. And if you look at Armenia's military doctrine after 2016, which was based on the 2014-2015 review, it was very straightforward. They basically said Armenian forces have to only hold off for 4 to 5 days until Russia secures a ceasefire. Well, that was our military doctrine. So anything over 4 or 5 days, Armenia stands no chance. And we saw precisely what happened in 2020 when, at the start of the war, right, the General Chief of Staff produced a report to the Prime Minister saying, sorry, we could only last for 4 days. And so while we boasted and made claims for 20, 25 years that we're the most powerful military in the South Caucasus, for the last 10 years, we've known that we cannot last more than 4 days. So this demonstrates the systemic structural problems not only in the military, but also in military thinking and strategy development.
Okay, we understand the negligence or the security doctrine that we had prior to 2018. We have 2018, we have a new government in place. Nikol Pashinyan becomes prime minister. And you're right, like to a large extent, the post Velvet government was categorically nescient. I'm going to use the word ignorant, if you don't mind, of Armenia's military limitations and shortcomings, while the pre Velvet governments were not only nescient, but also negligent. I raised this particular passage because I remember after the 2020 war, I interviewed a member of parliament and I asked the question. I said, did you not know the situation? Was Parliament, or you as a member of Parliament, did you not know the dire situation that we were in terms of power asymmetry? And he said, no, we were advised, we were briefed, and we were told that everything is fine. This I cannot understand.
Well, again, yeah. What we saw was so the Velvet happened in summer of early summer of 2018. The new government assumed electoral power in December of 2018, and within a 1 year time span, you had COVID and then the war. Clearly, no government in that short period of time can be able, a revolutionary government can be able to address the shortcomings and the structural deficiencies of a closed institution like Armenia's military. So, all the only thing that the civilian leadership could do is to rely on the expertise and feedback of the general staff, of the military brass. And I'm very sorry to say this, but at that point, our military brass was full of liars. And this lying was part of the military culture because it was a culture of cover up. The fact that they lied about the developments in 2016, the fact that they continuously lied about our military capabilities, right? It's not a surprise that they basically misled and they were not fully honest with their capabilities. And so the political leadership, right, did not have the capacity nor the sufficient knowledge, hence my usage of the term nescience, right, to fully understand the military capabilities of Armenia.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. Was that not their responsibility? I'm not a military strategist. I'm just a journalist, Nerses. I remember what happened in 2016, and the conversation was this is the beginning of something bigger that's coming. You come to power, how can you not have pushed back to understand what the situation was?
So again, I agree with you that these are two-tiered issues. One, did the Velvet government do enough to basically produce transparency and knowledge from the DoD? That's a very legitimate question. But two, if we go back to what we discussed, if you have a system and structure that's been developed as it has been developed in the last 15, 20 years, a 1 year time period is nowhere close to being able to decipher all the complexities and problems that this institution has. That's one. Two, and this is an open secret, we could talk about it, right? Armenia's military during that point was an extension of Russian interests. And so, overarchingly, a lot of our generals, a lot of our military brass during this period did not view the logic of democratic civilian oversight over military capabilities. It simply was not part of Armenia's political or military culture. And so, in that context, right, what we saw was a tendency of Armenia's military brass to mislead the civilian leadership. And yes, the civilian leadership was categorically clueless of military affairs because it was an extension of civil society that was dealing with domestic variables. And this is not uncommon because no civilian leadership has level of expertise with respect to defense or security. And so the understanding is you're supposed to rely, right, and expect honesty and truth from your institutions, especially one that addresses physical security. And so the consequences of those were as followed. Now, the factor here would be more consistent with your criticism if we look at it, for example, a few years after the fact, right? So, for example, Kocharyan knew from the very start what the military was, what its capabilities were, right? So 5, 6 years into his tenure, he knew perfectly well. Sir Sarkisian, right? He was involved in that stuff from the late 90s. But assuming, new administration, 3, 4, 5 years in his tenure, he knew perfectly well what the military was. The post-Velvet government in 1 year, 1.5 year, could not have known. Now the question is, do they now know 4 or 5 years into tenure what it is? Clearly they do. Clearly they do, right? They've learned the lessons, and that's where we're seeing all the reforms, the new huge arms procurements, etc., etc., etc. Also, because your security architecture is heavily embedded into Russia's broader security architecture, the political leadership remained limited in its ability to address these problems. We saw very clearly what happened when the civilian leadership, personified in the prime minister, criticized Russia's weapons systems. The chief of staff tried to undertake a coup. So to assume that in a 1 or 1 year time span, military civilian relations could be easily addressed, or that needs of honesty and transparency could be addressed, is just not consistent with reality. Our military structure has been designed in a way that the military brass function within their own domain. And this domain was not punctured until we saw the losses that we procured, that we accrued in 2020.
You say that the government today has learned lessons. Would you qualify or would you say that the military today has more civilian oversight than it did, say, in 2015?
Most definitely, because this is the first time in Armenia's history where you have a civilian running the military, right? You've had continuous, basically, well, the law was even designed that way that defense ministers had to be appointed within the military ranks. So what you had was a system that was self-perpetuating itself. So this is the first time that you have a defense minister that's actually a civilian that is appointed outside of the system. So, in that context, we are seeing a lot more civilian control over the military. We have seen a lot of military officers let go of their positions for the various reasons that in the past they would not be fired because they were part of the same circle or same structure. Also, we've seen the change in Armenia's procurement mechanisms, right? When you have a closed system, and that closed system basically produces leadership from its own structure, it's very hard to bring in new blood, change, or innovation. And this is why when you have a defense minister that is brought in from the outside, who is a civilian, that is the very definition of restructuring military civilian relations and having civilian oversight. So in that context, while we may not have sufficient civilian oversight over the military, for the various different reasons we've discussed, we've even written articles about this. However, we have a lot more civilian oversight over the military than we have ever had.
We have seen Armenia's government increase military spending to levels never before seen. Armenia is, as you mentioned, now working on bilateral relations with various countries to procure new weapons from India, France, and a number of other countries. In the current atmosphere, and you know, we can't have this podcast without discussing the change in administration that we're going to be seeing in the United States. How is this going to impact Armenia's progress or attempts at progress in reforming the military, in expanding military capabilities from training to armaments?
I don't anticipate any changes in that context. A few months back, we had a report. We published a report on America's defense diplomacy. And this is a big part of America's institutional investment and engagement with Armenia. So, defense diplomacy is a wide ranging strategy that the United States has that's not only applied to Armenia, but numerous partners. So, if this new administration comes in and cancels this policy, which is highly unlikely because it'll reverberate throughout the globe, America's relations with Armenia, as far as this strategy goes, isn't going to change. The assumption that the Trump administration will directly target Armenia and remove Armenia from this program also seems highly unlikely because there's simply no reasons to do that. And so when we look at America's policy of defense diplomacy and the fact that it has begun with Armenia and we're seeing the institutional engagements on this, I do not see that being ruptured because institutional continuity is not in the United States, it's not administration specific, at least something that is so technical and minute in relation to broader policy. Now, one change we can potentially see is if the Trump administration, for example, decide to cut funding to some of these programs, in which case what you might see is not an alleviation of a program or collaboration, but if the United States, for example, was able to send five, six delegations this year of various trainers, etc., it might send two or three by virtue of budgetary issues. These are sort of the minor nuance differences that might happen from the lens of qualifying these institutionally. And so a new administration is not going to have an effect on the functional relations of the countries. The only effect that we may see is at the broader geopolitical or regional policy level. That's very different than talking about the military reforms that we're seeing.
But the broader regional or global policies could impact those institutional relationships. Look, because we saw what a Trump administration in 2016, how it looked at the world, how it viewed the world, how it viewed itself vis-a-vis the world. To expect Trump now, 8 years later or 4 years after leaving office, and now coming back into office, changing sort of the paradigm of his foreign policy maybe is a little premature.
There's going to be the issue isn't the conversation here isn't a change in his in a paradigm or the doctrine of his foreign policy. The issue is if we're going to speak in comparative terms, When Trump came into power in 2016, Armenia had zero military relations with the United States. We had some engagements in NATO that we've had from since 2005, 2006, but with respect to the United States, we had no robust institutional engagements. Our relationship with the United States within that context was minimal because we were qualified as a Russian satellite. And so, comparing 2016, where there were almost no deep institutional relationships, and comparing it to now, where there are deep institutional relationships, are two different things. But if we're going to qualify the Trump doctrine and try to understand this, what we could do is we could look at the period of 2016 to 2020 and observe countries that had strategic partnership with the United States, that had defense diplomacy with the United States, and to see if Trump's foreign policy doctrine ruptured any of those variables. It did not. It had no effect on those components. In that context, right, from 2024 till 2028, we cannot anticipate rupturing of these institutional relations because Trump's foreign policy doctrine does not dictate or require a rupturing of institutional relations. Now, is his foreign policy going to be more isolationist or less isolationist in relation to his first term? That has nothing to do with the institutional components that we're talking about. That's a separate subject of conversation. Looking at the team that he's putting together within his group of security advisors, having had some engagement with this group, my understanding, and a lot of the international security experts that are discussing this are actually of the opinion that Trump's second administration is going to be a lot less isolationist than he tried to be during his first administration. And so, in that context, between people like Mike Pompeo being in the picture, Robert O'Brien being in the picture, Chris Miller, who's likely to be the next defense minister, being in the picture, these are not the isolationist individuals that are going to shape policies as had been anticipated. So while they may not be as diplomatically engaging as the Biden administration, they are not going to be as isolationist that we saw in their first term. But another thing to consider here is that, yes, the Biden administration was very diplomatically engaged, but this was also an administration that was highly, highly adverse to escalation or to any punitive demeanor. So when small states like Azerbaijan would prolong, obstruct, or disrupt these diplomatic endeavors of the United States, the Biden administration would not really do much to coerce or pressure Azerbaijan to refrain from that demeanor. Uh, Trump's administration is going to function very, very differently. While they may not be diplomatically that active, what we've seen is that they have zero problems in being relatively coercive or in being escalatory. And so the dynamics, the instruments that they use in advancing their perceived interests are different. And so while we may see relative diminishing of diplomatic engagement in the South Caucasus, we're not going to see the United States leaving the South Caucasus under a Trump administration.
Well, as always, Nerses, thank you for a very interesting conversation. We went a little bit over than we usually do. But for our listeners, I would really encourage you to read the October security briefing. I mean, all of our security briefings, but this one was very eye opening and very instructive, I would say, in understanding how we have to move forward in terms of our deterrence capabilities and protecting our own borders and the security of our country. So, thank you once again, Nerses.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on Examining the Context.